Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. If the information in the FBI's Carter Page warrant constituted probable cause for wiretapping an American political campaign, then the process and the officials involved in it carried out one of the most significant known violations of American civil liberties in recent history. That's Mark Penn, former Hillary Clinton campaign advisor and pollster, writing in The Hill on the Carter Page FISA warrant after the release of heavily redacted, but nevertheless some 400 pages of documents related to that FISA application to surveil Carter Page. Penn goes on to say, the evidence here is that there was no real evidence. You had the dossier, the Steele dossier, financed by the Democrats, unverified, so says the likes of Lindsey Graham over the weekend, and a Yahoo story with used as corroborating information. And Penn writes, it's a distortion to suggest, as some Democratic congressmen have maintained, that the Yahoo story was not used in a substantive way. It sure was. Of course, and so is the dossier. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the application. If they weren't needed, why include them in the application? And Andy McCarthy, our friend over at National Review, has a bit of a mea culpa on the topic. And so we're pleased to be joined by former Chief U.S. Assistant U.S. Attorney in Manhattan and contributing editor of National Review, Andy McCarthy. Andy, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Dan, Amy, how are you?
Good. You apparently were a bit taken aback by the documents released over the weekend because you've penned this interesting piece at National Review about the confirmation now that the FBI relied on that Steele dossier to obtain the warrant, something you were reticent to conclude up until this weekend.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. What I say is that I, at the very beginning, before we knew anything, told people that it would be silly to think that the FBI, which I worked with for 20 years as a prosecutor and very closely in a number of cases, that they would so radically depart from their procedures that they would take completely unverified hearsay information and just bring it to a court without going out and doing what the Bureau always does to corroborate things. I didn't think that once we learned what was in the application that was made to the FISA court, that you would even have any reference to Christopher Steele or the dossier in it. I figured what would have happened, which is what happens in a normal case, is if the FBI gets a tip, no matter where it's from, they'd take 8 or 9 facts that help them establish probable cause. They'd go out and scrub it, meaning they'd, develop witnesses, they'd, scrutinize documents and the like, and only bring to the court those things that they could corroborate, to the point where at that point the dossier would be irrelevant. It would be the FBI's independent investigation. But I think long, Dan, before we got what we got over the weekend, finally, which I think I've been screaming for as loud as anyone from the beginning of Trump's presidency to release this stuff. We've had these congressional hearings that have gone on for over a year, and we already had a very good idea. You mentioned the Grassley-Graham memo. We also had the Nunes memo. We had the House Intelligence Committee release its fuller report, and I think we've known for a while what we've now finally seen in black and white, mostly black because it's mostly blacked out. But we've known for a while that this is what they did. They brought uncorroborated information to the court.
Well, what does the Carter Page FISA warrant actually mean? What have you learned from reading it? What's the new information, if there's any?
Well, I think I'm sorry, Amy.
Oh yeah, no. What have you learned from it? From reading the 400-page plus warrant?
Well, I was well. First of all, everybody keeps talking about the 400-page dump on Saturday. I talked about it myself. Mm-hmm. When you really look at it carefully, what you find is it's really not 400 pages of information, and it's interesting to be reminded of this. I knew about it back when I was a prosecutor, and you had a present these packages for wiretaps to the court. A lot of it is not the actual factual information. A lot of it is blacked out copies of the orders and the certifications. And I'd say that's probably at least as much pagination in terms of numbers as the applications themselves. But the thing I think is striking, I guess, is two things. Number one, I was really taken by Byron York's piece yesterday because he, paragraph by paragraph, went through the Nunes memo, which got so much flack from Democrats and the media at the time that he released it. And as Byron shows line by line, what Nunes said to us about what was in these applications was completely accurate. So I think, the amazing thing, of course, is rather than an acknowledgement that it's accurate, it's like they've doubled down on the warpath that they were on against Nunes yesterday, which I just think, shows how political this is. And secondly, I'm also struck by the fact that even though the surveillance went on for a year, if you look at all four applications from October 2016 through June of 2017, they kept recycling the same stuff. I mean, you would think that there would be some dramatic change in at least the portions that we're able to see. But even when they cited to press reports, as we go from October to January to April to June, nothing changes. They just basically copy the last thing they said and they paste it into the next thing they say. And you would think if these media reports were vital to showing probable cause, sometime between, October of 2016 and the midsummer of 2017, somebody would have gone out and done some independent investigation so that they wouldn't have to rely on media reports anymore.
Do you agree with the excerpt from Mark Penn's piece that I read at the outset, that this, based on what we know now, this is one of the most significant known violations of American civil liberties in recent history?
I think he's right about that, but I put this caveat on it. He's right about it, assuming that what we've learned from these investigations is true. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, Dan, is you have to acknowledge a lot of stuff that's still blacked out that we haven't seen.
Right.
And if we hadn't had these hearings, I would say, well, who knows what's in those redacted portions. But judging by what we've been told in the hearings, like where McCabe says there's no way we would have been able to get this warrant unless we had the Steele dossier, or where Comey says we didn't have corroboration, so we relied on the credibility of Steele himself. We do have those bits and pieces. We have the two senators saying there's no information in these affidavits that corroborates the Steele dossier. So they basically just presented the dossier based on what they said was the good reputation of Steele. Since we have that information, I think we can confidently say, yes, we don't know what's in the redactions, but we know what's not in them, and what's not in them is corroboration to this dossier.
And with respect to the argument that was advanced by Jake Tapper when he interviewed Carter Page over the weekend and has been picked up by other Democrats to try and make the case this isn't political at all, that this warrant was renewed 3 times, that it was renewed by multiple judges appointed by Republican presidents. So there you go. It's bipartisan. Even Marco Rubio, sitting Republican senator, said that there was enough evidence to substantiate the warrant for Page surveillance. So this is not a partisan issue. This is based on the merits of the application.
Well, number one, it's a kind of a false portrayal of what partisan means anymore, because the fact that these judges may have been appointed by Republicans doesn't mean that they're not anti-Trump, right? We have a number of people who are Republicans who don't like the president. We've been dealing with that for a couple of years now. But I think more than that, I must say, I think number one, the judges did a lousy job from what I can see. That happens from time to time. It doesn't really matter who appoints them. They can do a lousy job. I've never been a fan of the FISA court. I always thought FISA was a bad idea. But let me just say one thing in response to this argument that is maybe it's a little inside baseball, but I think it's telling. When I was a prosecutor, if you had a wiretap that went on for a length of time, and some of these do go on for many months, one of the things that they always did where I worked in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan was a wiretap case got assigned to a particular judge so that each time you had to get it renewed when the authorization lapsed, you would go back to the same judge who would therefore be very familiar with the case and would be able to follow it along more closely. And I think the fact that they went to 4 different judges for this is an invitation to the kind of sloppiness and inattention to detail that went on here. You want one judge who is familiar with the whole case, and instead they seem to have gone to 4 different ones, which means you have to recreate the wheel every time and expect that these people are going to, read this closely every single time, even though they're completely unfamiliar, with the underlying facts. I think that's a very inefficient way to go about reauthorizations, and it leads to the kind of sloppiness I think you see here.
Let's go back to your old stomping grounds, the Southern District of New York, in the Cohen case. The release or the wave of privilege over the weekend for a tape that Cohen made involving him and President Trump speaking about the McDougal payment or non-payment. We don't know exactly what was said. We just know Giuliani's characterization and Lanny Davis's characterization and back and forth. And then yesterday, 12 more audio recordings seized during the Cohen raid, privilege wave turned over to the government. These tapes, give me a sense of what's going on with the Cohen case. You've written extensively about this too, that they're really trying to make out an extortion case here, and that the Trump is in some potential legal jeopardy. How do you read this progression of the case and the waiving of privilege on these tapes?
Well, I think the first thing that screams out at you is, why is a lawyer making tapes of people?
That's what I said.
It's really, yeah. I mean, it's to me that's really it's unethical.
Yep.
For a lawyer, if you're going to tape somebody, particularly in connection with legal work, you got to let the person know you're doing it. So I just that I don't get. But I've also maintained from the beginning that I don't think Cohen had what you would call a thriving legal practice.
Right.
I mean, from what we understand, he had a grand total of 3 clients. One being the president, who evidently hasn't really done work for during the time that Trump has been president. How much work he did before that, we don't know. He said that Sean Hannity was a client. Sean says that that's not true, and there isn't any evidence that it is true. And there's this one other guy, Brody, this big Republican contributor, who he seems to have engaged to do the same kind of a non-disclosure agreement he did with Trump in connection with an affair that guy is said to have had, and that's it. So I really think that what the government's looking at isn't Cohen's legal work, because it looks to me like there ain't much of it.
Well, do you think that?
But I would.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, do you think any of the
I
parties
was just
would
going
have?
to say he hasn't been charged yet.
Right.
I mean, we don't know.
Well, do you think any of the parties would have withdrawn privilege if there was anything incriminating on the tapes?
No, but I don't know that they're withdrawing privileges. I understand it. What happened is Barbara Jones, who used to be a federal judge and was my first boss, by the way, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, did a review of the evidence that was seized from Cohen to see, was it lawyer-client stuff, which it only is if it's, you're going to a lawyer having a confidential conversation about legal advice. Other than that, they're not attorney-client privileged information. And I don't think, I think what she was trying to analyze was how much of the stuff is actually covered by privilege. The stuff that is covered by privilege, they're not supposed to give to the government. So I think what's happened here is whatever has been turned over to the government, a determination's been made that it's not privileged. And I don't think people are, if you were a client, even if the tapes showed that you didn't do anything incriminating, if they showed things that were embarrassing, you wouldn't want that out there, so you wouldn't waive your privilege on that.
But
I have to think that what we're looking at is stuff that's not privileged.
Well, but Barbara Jones wrote that on July 20, 2018, the parties withdrew their designations of privileged as to 12 audio items that were under consideration by the special master.
Right.
Based upon those designations, the special master released the 12 items to the government that day. And right. Giuliani, clearly the tape that was talked about so much over the weekend regarding the McDougal matter, Giuliani clearly said we waived the privilege, and he called the tape that we haven't heard exculpatory.
Right. Well, look, we'll have to. What I think they're waiving. I mean, not to get hyper technical here.
Okay.
But I think what they're waiving is their right to go into court and argue that it's privileged.
I see.
Which is a different thing from it being privileged. But I just think it's very hard. There's so many of these situations that we're now dealing with, whether it's Trump and Russia or this Cohen situation, where there's a ton of stuff that's important that we don't know, and we're sort of being led down the rabbit hole to speculate about this or that part of it. And the ball I'm trying to keep my eye on it is, has Cohen been charged with anything yet? And does it appear that he has things going on in his life, mainly meaning his business life, that they could be investigating him for that don't have anything to do with Donald Trump? And I think
yeah, right.
That's what I'm focused on. I do think you're right that they're looking at that, and they're certainly looking at these non-disclosure agreements to see if there was anything extortionate, to see if there was any violation of campaign finance laws. I think that those are both very, very uphill things try to prove. But I don't know what other businesses Cohen was doing, and why he was a person of interest to them. I would conclude with this, though, by saying, again, that I think that if they thought Cohen was the key to showing collusion by Trump, for example, there's no way that Mueller would have let the case go to New York. He'd have held on to it.
Did you see that exchange between Avenatti, Stormy Daniels' attorney, and Dershowitz over the weekend, where Avenatti came? Avenatti came. Yeah, exactly. Well, this is where we're at. This is where we're at, Andy. I'm sorry. And he said there are more tapes in response to their discussion about the tape that did come out. There are more tapes, and Dershowitz. Well, how do you know that? The only way you could know that is improperly, and so he sort of characterized Michael Cohen and his relationship as evolving, and so
they ran into each other at a restaurant in New York.
And so that was he sort of insinuated that was the basis of his knowledge. I mean, does that strike you as strange, and does it raise any concerns about Avenatti getting information from the government he shouldn't have?
I just think that I don't know Avenatti. I'm trying to come up with the right analogy for what a debate between Alan Dershowitz and
yeah, right. Yes.
It's like sending Aaron Judge up to hit against Joey Bag of Donuts.
There you go.
I don't know if what Avenatti says is true or not. And I think that, and I don't mean to cast any more aspersions at him than what we can say on the basis of how he's performed here, but he just seems to me to be a publicity hog, and I'm kind of like when I hear him talk, I'm thinking, I want to see it, show me what you got, because I'm not going to the bank on anything this guy says.
Well, now, admittedly, he was crestfallen over the weekend after learning that Stormy Daniels is getting divorced, so he may not have been in his right mind. Andy McCarthy, former chief assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District, contributing editor at National Review, nationalreview.com. Andy, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Have a great day.
You too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about